Bruno.
Yeah, I get one too sometimes. Alberto, you can't. Alberto, you're gonna die. Alberto, don't put that in your mouth. Luca, it's safe. Don't listen to stupid Bruno. Sorry.
That sounds so cool. Lucky let's do it.
Yeah, for sure.
That dangerous up there. Maybe I can show you.
I told you, our son has a death wish.
But Mom, we're always careful.
We?
Me and my friend, Alberto. They're sending me to the deep to live with my weird see-through uncle. What do I do?
Stay?
Up here? They'll come looking for me.
Okay, that may be true, but
Papa, what's that? How do we get in?
it's Signor Vespa. Mannaggia, here we go.
Buongiorno a tutti! Oh, mamma mia, please, no morele.
Alberto!
Ah, just a little bath.
No!
It's
Ercole, basta!
Oh, look who's here.
Maybe that becomes a Vespa. How does that become? Just ask her! Fine.
Hello again.
Ciao.
Can we turn the money into something else? Something like...
That! Whoa, I'm doing it!
So can we be on the team?
Aspetta, you dodge obstacles when a little old lady crosses her path.
Why do you think he kills her brothers?
Anything that swings. This is your mother today.
Photos of fake Papa. Everyone photos.
Welcome back to the Film Box. If you're new here, I'm so glad you found this corner of the internet. This is the place where we don't just watch movies, we open them up piece by piece and look at everything inside. Today's box is a softer one, a smaller one in some ways. We're talking about Luca, the 2021 Pixar film that a lot of people watched once on a Friday night, smiled at, and then quietly moved on from. And I think that's exactly why it deserves a proper opening. Because underneath that sun-bleached Italian coastline and those big curious sea monster eyes, there's a film that's trying to say something real about friendship, about fear, and about the moment your whole world gets bigger than you expected. So get comfortable. Let's open this one together. Here's the hook, and I promise no spoilers, just the thing that makes this film worth your time even if you've already seen it. Luca is a film about a creature who has never once stepped onto land, and within the first act, that creature is standing upright, walking on two legs, speaking Italian, and pretending to be a boy. That transformation and everything it represents is the engine of this entire story. But here's what most people miss on a casual watch. The ocean in this film isn't just a setting. It's a metaphor that the film never explains out loud, and once you notice it, you can't stop seeing it everywhere. Stick with me, because before we even get into the story, there's a layer underneath this film that completely changes how you watch it. And that layer starts with the man who made it. Before we get into this story, let's talk about how this box was built. Because with Luca, the behind the scenes story is almost as personal as the film itself. The director Enrico Casarosa has said in interviews that this film comes directly from his own childhood. They grew up near Genoa on the Italian coast, and according to those same interviews, the friendship at the heart of this film, the bond between Luca and Alberto, was inspired by a real friend he had as a kid. Someone who pulled him toward adventure and away from the safe, predictable life his family expected of him. Once you know that, the whole film feels less like a fantasy and more like a memory wearing a costume. Here's another detail that changes things. Reportedly, before the COVID-19 pandemic shut everything down, the animation team traveled to the Italian Riviera, to towns like Vernazza, Manarola, and Portofino, to walk the streets, study the light, and sketch the architecture that would eventually become the fictional town of Porto Rosso in this film. That's why the town doesn't feel generic. It feels lived in, almost photographed, even though every frame is animated. Now here's a fact that shaped how this entire film reached audiences. Luca was originally planned for a theatrical release, but due to the ongoing impact of the pandemic, Disney made the decision to send it straight to streaming on Disney Plus, with no theatrical run in most of the world. That decision matters more than people realize, and we'll come back to it later, because it completely changed how this film was received and how it built its audience over time. On the technical side, animating water that behaves believably and then animating the instant a sea creature dries off and becomes human was reportedly one of the most demanding challenges the animation team faced on this project. That transformation effect, the one that happens again and again throughout the film, required an enormous amount of behind the scenes problem solving just to make it feel instant, magical, and physically convincing every single time it happens. And then there's the voice cast, which is one of the more interesting casting choices Pixar has made in recent years. Jacob Tremblay voices Luca, and Jack Glazer voices Alberto, two young actors who already had strong dramatic resumes before this, which gives their friendship a surprising amount of emotional weight for an animated kids' film. But the casting choice that really stands out is Sacha Baron Cohen as Uncle Ogo, Luca's deep-sea uncle who appears for one unforgettable stretch of the film. It's a strange, almost unsettling bit of casting on paper, and once you see the character, you'll understand exactly why we chose him. Knowing all of this before we even open the story changes how you watch it. You're not just watching a cartoon about sea monsters anymore. You're watching one filmmaker's memory of growing up on the Italian coast, labeled frame by people who walked those same streets. So let's actually open the box. Luca was released in 2021, directed by Enrico Casarosa. His feature directorial debut after years working at Pixar on films like Up and Ratatouille, and after directing the beloved short film La Luna. The voice cast includes Jacob Tremblay, Jack Glazer, Emma Berman, Saverio Raimondo, Maya Rudolph, Jim Gaffigan, and Sacha Baron Cohen. Genre-wise, this sits firmly in the family animation and coming-of-age space. But underneath that label, it's really a story about two kids on the edge of growing up, and what happens when one of them is ready to leap and the other isn't sure he's allowed to. At its heart, this is a story about the friend who shows you a world you didn't know you were allowed to want, and what it costs you to follow them into it. Now, before we go any further, here's the spoiler free verdict, because I know some of you are deciding right now whether this is worth your time tonight. Should you watch Luca? Yes, especially if you want something warm, visually gorgeous, and emotionally gentle rather than emotionally heavy. This is not a film that's going to wreck you the way some of Pixar's other work does. It's smaller, quieter, and more personal than that. But here's the honest part of this verdict, and I'll be upfront about it from the start. This is a film I walked away from with a rating of 5.4 out of 10. Not because it's badly made. It's gorgeous, and it's clearly made with love, but because of what it doesn't quite reach for, especially when you compare it to what this story is clearly capable of being. We'll get into exactly why later. For now, just know this. Luca is worth watching, but it's a film that plays it safer than its own premise deserves. Let's talk about that first watch feeling, because this is where the film genuinely shines, even before the story kicks in. The opening of Luca drops you straight into the ocean. Not a stylized, cartoonish ocean, but something that feels closer to a nature documentary. Light filters down through the water in these soft, shifting beams, and the whole world feels quiet, almost sacred. I walked into this film expecting a loud, joke-driven kids' comedy. Instead, the film gave me something closer to a lullaby. The atmosphere in those first few minutes is gentle and a little melancholy, even before you understand why. You see Luca herding fish like a farm boy, herding sheep, living a quiet, repetitive life under the surface, and there's this immediate sense of a kid who's curious about something just out of reach. What hooked me in the first 10 minutes wasn't a joke or an action beat, it was a sense of distance. The human world is right there, just above the surface, shimmering and forbidden, and you can feel how badly this kid wants to know what's up there. That longing is the first thing this film gets completely right, and it's the emotional thread that everything else gets built on top of. And that's exactly where the story begins to move. Because once that longing meets a certain reckless, sun-drenched stranger from above the waves, everything in Luca's quiet little world starts to change. So now we step into the story properly, and I want you to picture this moment with me. Luca's world up to this point has been small. It's been chores, it's been rules, it's been his mother's voice telling him over and over that the surface is dangerous, that land monsters will hurt him, that curiosity is the most dangerous thing a young sea creature can have. And then one day, while he's out herding fish like he always does, he meets Alberto. Alberto is everything Luca isn't. He's older, he's scruffier, he lives completely alone in a crumbling stone tower on a tiny island, and he has absolutely no fear of the surface world. In fact, he's obsessed with it. He's been collecting human objects for years. Bits of machinery, broken tools, scraps of fabric, and he treats every single one of them like sacred artifacts from a world he's desperate to understand. Here's where it gets layered almost immediately. Alberto shows Luca something that completely rewires how Luca sees himself. He climbs out of the water onto dry land, and right in front of Luca, his scales disappear. His skin changes. He becomes, for all visual purposes, a human boy. And then he steps back into the water, and just like that, he's a sea creature again. Luca is stunned. His entire life, he's been told that the surface is forbidden, that it's lethal, that land monsters are something to fear from a distance. And here's proof, standing right in front of him, that the line between sea monster and human is thinner than paper. It's just water, that's it. That's the whole barrier his parents have built their entire worldview around. And this is where the film does something I think is genuinely smart, even if it underplays it. Alberto doesn't just show Luca the surface, he shows Luca a version of freedom that Luca didn't know he was allowed to want. Up on the surface, away from the watching eyes of Luca's parents, the two of them build a makeshift Vespa out of junk they've scavenged, broken pipes, an old umbrella, scraps of metal, and they sit on it together. imagining the open road. Alberto talks about his dream with this intensity that almost borders on desperation. To him, a real Vespa isn't just a vehicle, it's an escape. It's proof that somewhere out there, life is bigger than this lonely little island and this lonely little tower he's been left in. And notice, the film never spells this out directly, but Alberto is a kid who was abandoned by his own father. That tower he lives in alone isn't just a quirky detail, it's the loneliest image in the entire film, and it's sitting there quietly in the background of every single one of his big, excited speeches about freedom. For Luca, though, this friendship becomes something else entirely. It becomes his first taste of choice. Every day he sneaks away from his chores to meet Alberto on the surface, and every day that little island world gets a tiny bit bigger. But of course, his parents notice, and here's where the film makes its first real emotional turn. Luca's parents, terrified that he's been going to the surface, come up with what they think is a loving solution. They decide to send Luca away, down into the deep ocean, to live with his reclusive Uncle Ugo, a creature so adapted to deep sea life that he's practically blind, covered in strange bioluminescent growths, and has clearly been alone in the dark for a very, very long time. From the parents' point of view, this is protection. From Lucas' point of view, this is a prison sentence disguised as safety. And I think that's such a sharp, quietly devastating piece of writing because it's not coming from cruelty, it's coming from fear. Lucas' parents aren't villains. They are scared people making a scared decision, and scared decisions hurt the people you love most. Faced with the terrifying idea of being sent to live in the lightless deep with Uncle Ugo forever, Luca makes the first truly brave choice of his life. He runs. He and Alberto flee together, not just to the surface for an afternoon, but properly, fully onto land, into the nearby fishing village of Porto Rosso. And here's where the film opens up into something much bigger, because Porto Rosso isn't some friendly, welcoming town. This is a town that has built its entire identity around fear of sea monsters. There are paintings of sea creatures depicted as terrifying beasts. There are statues commemorating monster hunts. The fear that Luca's parents instilled in him about land monsters, it turns out land has the exact same fear, pointed in the opposite direction. Two communities, separated by a few feet of water, each terrified of the other, each one convinced the other side is the monster. Disguised as ordinary human boys, soaked in fear of getting wet because even a single splash of water will reveal their true forms in front of everyone. Luca and Alberto stumble into the life of a local girl named Julia, and Julia is one of the most quietly important characters in this entire film because she's an outsider too, just in a completely different way. She's an off-season visitor, the daughter of a one-armed fisherman named Massimo, and the town doesn't quite know what to do with her either. She's loud, she's a little odd, she's relentlessly curious about facts, fish facts, space facts, any facts, and the other kids in town treat her like a joke. Her one goal, her entire reason for existing in the story is to finally beat the town's reigning champion, a smug, arrogant local named Ercole Visconti, in the Porto Rosso Cup, an annual triathlon that involves swimming, cycling, and eating an enormous plate of pasta. Here's the moment the film quietly clicks into gear. Luca and Alberto realize that if they win this race, the prize money is exactly enough to buy a real Vespa Alberto's dream, finally within reach. So they agree to enter under fake names, training with Julia, hiding their secret every single day, hoping desperately that they never ever get splashed with water in public. And this is where the film starts asking its real question, even if it never says it out loud. Living in Porto Rosso means Luca gets something he's never had before, a classroom. Julia takes him to actual lessons, real books, real teachers, and Luca lights up in a way we haven't seen from him yet. This is a kid who has spent his entire life being told that curiosity is dangerous, and suddenly he's sitting in a room where curiosity is the entire point. You can feel even through an animated character how starved this kid has been for this exact feeling. But here's where the friendship starts to crack, and this is genuinely some of the most honest writing in the film. Alberto doesn't want to go to school. He's never been to school. He can't read particularly well, and more than that, school represents something he's never had access to, something that quietly makes him feel small. So while Luca starts spending his days in a classroom, lit up with excitement, Alberto starts spending his days alone again. And alone is the wound this character has been carrying since before we even met him. The dream that was supposed to belong to both of them, the Vespa, the open road, the escape, starts to feel to Alberto like it's slipping into something that's only Luca's now. And he can feel Luca pulling away from him piece by piece toward a life Alberto was never invited into. This is the moment the film changes everything. Not with an explosion, but with a quiet, slow building resentment between two kids who love each other and don't have the emotional vocabulary to say so. And underneath all of it, there's a secret neither of them knows is about to come out. Luca's parents have come looking for him. They've come up onto land, disguised as humans themselves, searching the town, terrified, calling his name. And Alberto, out of fear, out of jealousy, out of a desperate need to keep Luca close, makes a choice. He hides it from him. And this is the moment the box opens completely. Before we get to what happens next, though, let's actually talk about what this film does brilliantly. Because even with everything still ahead of us, there's so much here worth celebrating. Start with the voice acting. Jacob Tremblay gives Luca this constant undercurrent of wide-eyed wonder. But what really stands out is Jack Dylan Grazer as Alberto. There's a scene early on where Alberto is talking about his absent father, brushing it off, acting like it doesn't matter, like he's totally fine being alone, and you can hear underneath the bravado a kid who is absolutely not fine. That's not easy to pull off in voice acting alone without a face to read, and Grazer nails it. Story construction wise, the film's central idea that fear of the other is mirrored on both sides of the water is genuinely elegant. It's simple enough for a child to understand intuitively, and layered enough for an adult to sit with afterward. The film doesn't lecture you about prejudice. It just shows you two communities, each convinced the other is a monster, and lets you sit in the irony. Visually, this might be one of the most beautiful films Pixar has ever produced. The water animation alone, the way light bends and scatters underwater, the way the surface of the sea looks from below, is stunning. And the town of Porto Rosso itself feels tactile. Sun-bleached walls, crumbling stone steps, laundry lines strung between buildings. Every frame looks like a postcard that's been lived in for 100 years. The transformation effect, sea creature to human and back again, is also handled with so much visual confidence that it never feels like a gimmick. It feels like magic with rules. And musically, the enormous score leans into Italian folk instrumentation, accordion, mandolin, strings that feel sun-warmed, and it gives the entire film this gentle, nostalgic glow, even in its quieter, sadder moments. The one truly unforgettable scene for me is the Vespa daydream sequence, the moment where Luca and Alberto imagine riding off into the world together, and the animation shifts into this looser, painterly style, almost like a moving watercolor. It's the emotional peak of their friendship, visualized as pure freedom, and it's genuinely gorgeous. And here's where I have to be honest with you, this is also where some of the film's problems start to show. Because for a story built on such a rich, emotionally loaded premise, two terrified communities, a friendship built on secrets, a kid discovering an entire hidden side of himself, Luca often pulls back right when it should be leaning in. The pacing through the middle stretch moves quickly, almost too quickly, skating past emotional beats that feel like they deserve more room to breathe. Alberto's loneliness, his abandonment, his growing resentment, it's all there, it's all real, but it often gets compressed into single scenes or single lines when it feels like it's reaching for something much bigger underneath. There's also a sense, especially compared to other recent Pixar films that dig deep into identity and difference, that Luca keeps circling around a more personal, more specific metaphor without ever fully committing to it. The film gives you everything you need to feel something enormous, and then again and again it chooses to stay gentle, stay light, stay safe. For some viewers, that restraint is exactly what makes the film feel warm and rewatchable. For me, it's the reason this film, as beautifully made as it is, never quite reaches the emotional heights its own premise was clearly capable of. And that tension between what this film could have been and what it chooses to be is something we're going to come back to, because it sits right at the center of how this film was received when it came out, and how it's been rediscovered since. Let's step back for a moment and talk about the world this film actually arrived into, because timing matters more with Luca than with almost any other Pixar release in recent memory. This film came out in June of 2021, right in the middle of a period when the entire world was still reeling from the pandemic. Movie theaters were inconsistent, families were still cautious about gathering in large indoor spaces, and Disney made the call to send Luca straight to Disney Plus with no theatrical charge attached, available to anyone with a subscription. On one hand, that decision meant the film reached an enormous number of households instantly, without the usual barrier of a ticket price. On the other hand, it also meant Luca arrived quietly. There was no big theatrical weekend, no opening night buzz, no box office numbers to point to as a measure of success. It just appeared on a streaming service the way a new show might, and people either noticed it or they didn't. And I think that quiet arrival actually shaped the conversation around this film in a really specific way. Critically, Luca was received warmly but not rapturously. Reviewers praised the animation, the warmth, the setting, the central friendship. But a recurring thread in critical response was this sense that the film was holding something back, that it was circling a deeper, more personal story without ever fully stepping into it. Audiences, meanwhile, responded a little differently. For a lot of viewers, especially younger viewers and families, Luca was simply a lovely, comforting, visually stunning film to put on during a difficult time in the world. It didn't need to be a gut punch, it just needed to be warm, and it was. But here's where things get really interesting, and this is something that's developed mostly after the film's initial release. Over time, particularly within LGBTQ communities and among viewers who grew up feeling like they had to hide a part of themselves, Luca has been increasingly read as a story about a closeted identity, a story about a kid who discovers a hidden truth about who he is, who has to keep that truth secret from his own family out of fear of how they'll react, who finds a small, supportive community where that truth is finally safe, and who eventually has to make a choice about whether to live openly or stay hidden. Reportedly, the director has spoken about the film in terms of universal themes of difference and belonging rather than confirming any single specific allegorical reading. But the metaphor has resonated deeply with many viewers regardless, and that's secondary life. The conversations, the essays, the rewatches with this lens applied has given Luca a kind of staying power that its quiet initial release didn't necessarily suggest it would have. This is exactly the kind of thing we mean here at the Film Box when we talk about a film's second life. Sometimes a movie's meaning isn't fully understood the moment it's released. It grows layer by layer as more people sit with it and bring their own lives to it. As for awards, Luca didn't sweep through major ceremonies the way some Pixar predecessors have. It received recognition in animation-specific circles and was part of the conversation for major animated feature awards that season, though it ultimately didn't take home the top prizes in that category that year. Some viewers and critics have argued that the film was a little overlooked, especially when you consider the sheer craft on display. The water animation alone frankly deserved more attention than it got. Whether that's a fair criticism or just the natural result of a crowded release here is something reasonable people disagree on. But it's part of the conversation around this film's legacy. And in terms of its streaming life, this is a film that has had remarkable staying power on Disney Plus. It's the kind of movie that gets put on for a rainy afternoon, that gets rediscovered by teenagers scrolling through their watch list, that gets recommended in online communities not for being the flashiest Pixar film, but for being one of the most quietly comforting. Does it feel timeless, or does it feel like a product of its specific moment? Honestly, I think it's a bit of both. The friendship at its core, the fear of being different, the longing to see more of the world than the one you were born into, those feelings are timeless. But the circumstances of its release, arriving the way it did, during the world it arrived into, gave it a specific emotional context that a lot of people associate with that strange, quiet summer of 2021. For some viewers, that context is part of why this film means so much to them. Now let's go even deeper, because underneath everything we've talked about so far, the friendship, the secrets, the race, the town, there's a simpler question sitting at the heart of this film, and I think it's a question almost everyone watching has asked themselves at some point in their life. What happens when the people who love you most are also the people who are most afraid for you? Luca's parents aren't wrong to be scared. The world above the water genuinely is dangerous for them. But their fear, expressed as overprotection, almost pushes Luca into exactly the situation they were trying to prevent. And I think that's something so many people recognize from their own lives. The parent, the sibling, the partner, whose love comes wrapped in so much fear that it starts to feel like a cage, even when that's never the intention. And then there's Alberto's side of the story, which I think is honestly the emotional core the film never quite gives enough room to. He is a kid who has built an entire identity around not needing anyone, around being fearless, being free, being the one who doesn't care what anyone thinks. And underneath all of that performance is a kid who was left behind by the one person who was supposed to never leave. Every time Alberto talks big about freedom and adventure, what he's really saying is, please don't leave me too. And I think almost everyone watching this film has known someone like that. Maybe has been someone like that. The friend who acts like they don't need anything from anyone, right up until the moment they're terrified of losing you. This is the layer that connects this whole film to something real in your own life. It's not really about sea monsters. It's about the friend who shows you a door you didn't know existed, and the fear of what happens to that friendship once you walk through it without them. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now, go watch it, and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. So here's everything that happens from this point forward, and here's what it all means. Alberto, terrified of losing Luca to this new life, to school, to Julia, to a future that doesn't seem to have room for him in it, makes the decision to hide the fact that Luca's parents have come to town looking for him. It's not a cruel decision, it's a desperate one. And when Luca eventually finds out that Alberto knew and said nothing, the betrayal lands hard. Because it's not really about the secret itself, it's about what the secret represents. Is proof to Luca that Alberto would rather keep him trapped in their small shared world than let him go and grow. The fallout from this is the lowest emotional point of the film. The two of them fight, not with violence, but with the kind of cutting honesty that only happens between people who know exactly where to aim. Alberto, hurt and humiliated, ends up exposed publicly, soaked with water in front of the entire town, his sea creature form revealed for everyone to see. And here's the moment that changes the entire trajectory of the story. Luca, given the choice to step forward and stand with his friend, or to stay hidden and protect the new life he's been building, hesitates. And in that hesitation, Alberto sees everything he was afraid of confirmed. This is without question the emotional gut punch of the film, and here's why it works. It's not a moment of cruelty. Luca doesn't choose against Alberto out of malice. He freezes out of fear, out of self-preservation, out of the exact same instinct his parents have spent his whole life drilling into him. And in that single frozen moment, Luca becomes, briefly, the very thing his parents always were. Someone who chooses safety over the person who needs them. Alberto runs. Luca's parents, who have also been exposed in the chaos, are forced to reveal themselves too. And in front of the entire town of Portoruso, a town built on generations of fear towards sea creatures, an entire family of monsters stands there, soaking wet, completely exposed, with absolutely nowhere left to hide. And here's the moment that genuinely surprised me, and I think it's the strongest beat in the entire film. The town doesn't attack Massimo, Giulia's father. a man who has every reason, by his town's own mythology, to see these creatures as a threat, looks at them and instead of fear, there's recognition. He lost a hand to the sea himself. He understands in some way that the ocean and the things that live in it aren't simple villains. And in that moment, the entire fear the film has been building since its opening, fear of land, fear of sea, fear of the other, starts just slightly to crack open. The race still happens. Luca, now openly a sea creature in front of everyone, competes anyway, and the moment where he's racing through the streets, partially transformed, rain pouring down on him, fully visible for exactly who he is the visual and emotional payoff for everything the film has been building toward. He's not hiding anymore. And that, more than the race itself, is the actual victory. But the bigger ending, the one that matters most, comes after. Luca's parents, having seen what happened, having seen their son openly accepted by people they spent his whole life telling him to fear, make the hardest decision a parent in this kind of story can make. They let him go. They allow Luca to stay in Porto Rosso, to go to school, to live the life he's been dreaming about, even though it means letting him live in a world they've always been afraid of, and even though it means he won't be coming home with them. Here's the detail most people miss on a first watch, and it's a quiet one. When Luca's mother finally accepts this, she doesn't do it because she stopped being afraid. She does it because she recognizes the look on her son's face, the same look she probably once had, looking at something just out of reach. Fear doesn't disappear in descending. It just gets overridden by love and by memory. As for Alberto, and this is the part of the ending that I think is the most quietly beautiful, he doesn't get to stay either at first. Hurt and still feeling like the outsider, he chooses to leave Porto Rosso, planning to head off alone, back toward his old life of isolation. But Luca goes after him. And in the film's final emotional beat, it's revealed that Massimo, Giulia's father, offers Alberto a place, a job on his boat, a home of sorts. For a kid who has spent the entire film terrified of being left behind, being chosen, being wanted by someone on purpose is the most powerful thing that could happen to him. There's no traditional post-credits scene in the sense of a twist or a tease for a sequel, but the final images of the film, Luca and Alberto together, with Giulia in Porto Rosso, with the ocean right there beside them, no longer something to fear or hide from, function as their own kind of epilogue. The barrier between land and sea hasn't disappeared, but for these characters it's no longer a wall, it's just water. My honest reaction to this ending, it's tender and it's earned and it made me feel something. But it also confirmed exactly the thing I'd been sensing throughout the whole film. Every conflict gets resolved gently. Every fear gets softened rather than confronted head on. The town doesn't have to truly grapple with generations of prejudice, it just sort of lets it go in the moment because the story needs it to. And I understand why the film makes that choice. It's a film aimed at comforting people, especially given when it was released. But for me, an ending that resolves this beautifully also resolves a little too easily, given everything the story set up. Now, before we get to the final verdict, I want to slow down even more. Because there are characters and scenes in this film that deserve their own spotlight, and on a first watch, most of them slide right past you. Let's open this part of the box piece by piece, person by person, because every character in Luca is carrying something quiet underneath the surface, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start with Luca himself, because his arc is more carefully built than people give it credit for. Look closer at how he's introduced herding fish, alone, following a schedule that isn't even his own, set by his mother. He's not unhappy exactly, but he's never been given a single opportunity to ask what he wants. Every decision in his life has been made for him in the name of safety. So when Alberto shows up, what Luca is actually responding to isn't just adventure, it's choice itself. For the first time in his life, someone is asking him, "What do you want to do?" instead of telling him what he's allowed to do. That's why he says yes to everything Alberto suggests, even the genuinely dangerous stuff. It's not recklessness, it's a kid drunk on the unfamiliar feeling of being asked. And here's a detail that hits differently once you notice it. Throughout the film, Luca is constantly performing as a human, performing as confident, performing as someone who belongs in Porto Rosso. But the moments where he's most himself are the quiet ones alone with Alberto, where neither of them has to pretend. The tragedy of the middle section isn't that Luca finds something new in Julia's classroom, it's that he starts performing there too, just a different performance. He becomes the promising student, the kid Julia's mother approves of, the version of himself that fits neatly into this new world. And in doing that, he leaves Alberto behind in the one place Alberto never had to perform at all. Now let's talk about Alberto, because honestly this is the character the film is really about, even if the marketing puts Luca front and center. Picture this moment. Early in the film, Alberto shows Luca his tower. It's falling apart. There's a chair set up at a table for two, but only one chair is actually used. The other one is just there, waiting. Nobody ever points at it and says that was his father's chair. The film doesn't need to. It's just sitting in the background of every scene in that tower, and once you notice it, you can't watch a single moment in that space the same way again. Here's where it gets layered even further. Alberto's entire personality, loud, fearless, obsessed with human stuff, always performing bravery, is a shield. Every single thing he's excited about in this film is something he's teaching himself, alone from scraps. He doesn't know how engines actually work. He doesn't know how to read well. He's built an entire identity out of guessing, out of pretending he knows more than he does, because the alternative is admitting that nobody ever taught him anything. And when Luca starts actually learning things, real facts, real knowledge from real teachers, it doesn't just threaten their friendship, it threatens the entire foundation Alberto built his self-worth on. For the first time, someone Alberto taught is now teaching him things he doesn't know. That's not jealousy in the simple sense, that's an identity crisis. This is the moment the film changes how you see their fight. It's not really about a secret being kept. It's about Alberto watching the one person who made him feel like he mattered start to feel, for the first time, like Alberto might not be enough anymore. Now, Julia. Here's what most people may say about her. On the surface, she's comic relief, the loud, slightly awkward girl obsessed with facts, the one the other kids in town avoid. But look closer at why the town avoids her. It's not because she's annoying, it's because she's different in a way the town doesn't have a category for. She doesn't fit the mold of a normal Porto Rosso kid, and instead of changing herself to fit in, she's double down on exactly who she is. Facts, curiosity, intensity, all of it turned up to maximum. And here's the quiet detail. Julia never asks Luca and Alberto to be anything other than what they are. She is the only character in the entire film who befriends them with zero conditions attached. No, but only if. No, as long as you. Just, you're here, you're interesting, let's be friends. For two characters who spend their entire lives being told they have to hide or change to be accepted, that's not a small thing. That's everything. And then there's Massimo, Julia's father, the one-armed fisherman, and I think his role in this story is one of the most underappreciated pieces of writing in the whole film. Here's a man who lost a part of his body to the sea. By every logic the town operates on, he should be the most afraid of sea creatures, the most likely to react with hostility when Luca and Alberto are exposed. And instead, he is the one who looks at them, really looks, and sees something the rest of the town doesn't. Why? Because Massimo has already lived through the thing the town fears. He's already faced the monster literally and survived it and kept living his life anyway. His fear has already burned out and turned into something closer to respect. He's the bridge character, the one person whose life experience lets him see past the town's mythology. And it's not an accident that he's the one who, in the end, offers Alberto a home. Now let's talk about Luca's parents for a second, Daniela and Lorenzo, because they get less screen time than almost anyone else. But their arc is doing something really specific. Here's the detail that recontextualizes everything about them. When they come up onto land searching for Luca, disguised as humans, they're not just looking for their son. They're stepping for the first time in their adult lives into the exact world they've spent years telling Luca is too dangerous to enter. And the film never makes a big deal out of that. He just lets it sit there. Two creatures who built their entire parenting philosophy around never go up there are now standing on land, soaking wet with fear, doing the one thing they swore they'd never do, because their son needed them to. That's not a small character beat. That's the entire theme of the film, happening quietly, to the parents in the background of someone else's story. Let's also take a moment for Ercole Visconti, the arrogant local champion, because even though he's clearly written as the film's comic antagonist, there's a small detail that gives him an extra layer if you're paying attention. Ercole isn't actually that talented. He wins because nobody's ever bothered to challenge him, and because he's built a reputation that intimidates people before the race even starts. In other words, Ercole's power in this story is almost entirely social. He's not dangerous because he's strong. He's dangerous because everyone's already decided he's unbeatable before they even try. And that's a quiet little mirror of the bigger fear-based thinking running through this entire film. Fear that's inherited. Fear that nobody questions. Fear that becomes truth simply because nobody's ever tested it. Now, let's slow down and actually look frame by frame almost at three specific sequences, because this is where the film's craft really earns its keep and where a lot of the emotional weight is hiding in plain sight. First, the transformation scene. The very first time Luca sees Alberto step out of the water and become human. Watch how this is shot. The camera doesn't cut away, doesn't hide the moment behind a splash of water or a quick edit. It holds on Alberto's body as the change happens in real time right in front of Luca, and by extension, right in front of you. That choice matters. The film wants you to sit in the same disorientation Luca is feeling. There's no trick here, no movie magic shortcut. It's presented as something almost biological, almost mundane. Water on, monster, water off, boy. And by refusing to dramatize it, the film quietly tells you something important. This transformation isn't the scary part. The fear was always somewhere else. The fear was in the stories Luca was told, not in the reality standing right in front of him. Second, the Vespa daydream sequence, which I mentioned briefly before, but it deserves a much closer look. This is the moment where the animation style itself shifts. Backgrounds become looser, more painterly, almost like the film is dreaming alongside its characters. Watch the color palette here. Up until this point, the film has used a fairly grounded, sun-bleached Mediterranean palette, warm but realistic. In the daydream, the colors become almost impressionistic, swirling slightly unreal. That's not just a stylistic flourish. It's the film visually telling you that this freedom, this open road, this future exists only in imagination right now. It's beautiful precisely because it's not real yet. And when the daydream ends and the film snaps back to its normal visual language, there's a tiny, almost imperceptible deflation. The real world, even at its most beautiful, can't quite match the version these two kids have built in their heads. That gap between the dream and the reality is the entire emotional tension of their friendship, compressed into about 90 seconds of animation. Third, the race finale, specifically the moment Ruka is exposed mid-race, partially transformed, in front of the entire town, in the rain. Here's what's brilliant about how this is staged. The rain isn't just weather. Rain in this film has only ever meant one thing up to this point: exposure, danger. The thing Luca and Alberto have spent the entire film desperately avoiding. So when Luca is caught in the open, in the rain, mid-transformation, in front of everyone, visually, this is the worst-case scenario the film has been building towards since Act 1. And instead of treating it as a disaster, the film keeps the pace of the race going. Life continues. Luca keeps moving. The crowd reacts, but the world doesn't end. That's the whole point. The thing he's been terrified of his entire life happens, and it's survivable, more than survivable. It's the moment he finally looks fully, completely like himself. Now, here's where it gets really interesting because Luca doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a much longer thread running through Enrico Casarosa's work, and once you connect the dots, the film opens up even farther. Years before Luca, Casarosa directed a short film called La Luna, a quiet, dialogue light story about a young boy learning a family trait from his father and grandfather, set against a surreal, dreamlike nighttime sky. If you watch La Luna and then watch Luca back to back, you start to notice the same fingerprints, a fascination with generational expectation, with a young character caught between what their family wants for them and what they're discovering on their own, and with water and light used as emotional language rather than just scenery. Luca isn't a remake of that short by any means, but it feels like the same filmmaker, years later, asking a bigger, more personal version of the same question. What do you do when the path your family has laid out for you doesn't match the person you're becoming? And it's worth placing Luca next to other Pixar coming of age stories too, because the comparison tells you a lot about what makes this film distinct. Films like Inside Out or Coco tackle big, universal emotional truths: grief, memory, the nature of feelings themselves through fairly abstract, almost mythological storytelling structures. Luca does something different. It's small scale, almost domestic. There's no afterlife, no control room of emotions, no grand metaphysical framework. It's just two kids, a town, a secret, and a race. That smallness is actually one of its quiet strengths. It makes the film feel less like a fable and more like a memory. But it's also, I think, part of why it doesn't hit with the same overwhelming force as some of those other films. Big mythic structures give a story permission to go to extremes. A small, grounded story about two kids on a coastline has to earn its emotional peaks through specificity and restraint. And Luca, as we've talked about, often chooses restraint over peak. Let's also open up a few of the smaller hidden details, the kind of thing that rewards a second or third watch. Here's one. Pay attention to how often water appears in this film, not as danger but as comfort, in scenes involving Alberto specifically, rain on the roof of his tower, waves at night. For Luca, water becomes something to fear once he starts building a life on land. For Alberto, water never stops being home. It's the one place he's never had to pretend. That's a quiet, unspoken contrast between the two characters that the film never states outright, but it's there in nearly every frame the two of them share near the coastline. Here's another detail: the books. When Luca first enters Julia's house and sees her collection of books and encyclopedias, watch his reaction closely. It's not just curiosity. There's almost a hunger in it. And later, when he's reading by candlelight, hiding it from Alberto, notice that he's not reading for school. He's reading because he can't stop. That's the moment this film quietly tells you that Luca's curiosity was never going to stay contained to the surface as a concept. Once the door to knowledge opened even slightly, there was no closing it again. Alberto opened a door for Luca that was about freedom and adventure. Julia opened a door that was about something Luca didn't even know he was missing: the simple experience of learning for its own sake. And one more: listen to how the town's mythology around sea creatures is depicted visually, in murals, statues, and decorations throughout Porto Rosso. These depictions are exaggerated, monstrous, almost cartoonish in how frightening they are compared to the actual sea creatures we've spent the whole film with. That gap between the myth and the reality is the film's central irony made literal. The town has been decorating its walls with nightmares for generations, and the actual monsters turn out to be a couple of curious kids who just wanted to ride a Vespa. Once you notice that gap, you start seeing it everywhere. In how Luca's parents describe land monsters, in how the town describes sea monsters, in how Ercole talks about anyone he considers beneath him. Fear in this film is always bigger than the thing it's afraid of. Every single time. Now let's take this even deeper, because there's one more reading of this film worth sitting with, one that doesn't cancel out the hidden identity interpretation we talked about earlier, but sits alongside it. You can also watch Luca as an immigration story, or more broadly, a story about leaving home for a better opportunity and the complicated grief that comes with that for the person leaving and for the family left behind. Think about the shape of it. A young person from a small insular community discovers that a bigger world exists just beyond the place they were told was the edge of everything. They go there in secret at first. They find people who accept them. They start building a future. Education, friendships, a sense of belonging that their home community could never have offered them. And eventually, their family has to confront the reality that the life their child wants is a life that exists somewhere else, among people who aren't like them, in a place they themselves are afraid of. That's not just a metaphor for hidden identity, that's also, almost beat for beat, the emotional shape of countless real family stories about migration, about kids growing up to live lives their parents can't fully follow them into. And I think part of why Luca has connected with so many different kinds of viewers for so many different reasons is exactly this. The structure underneath the story is flexible enough to hold multiple personal truths at once. Whether you see yourself in Luca because of identity, because of family expectations, because of leaving a hometown, or just because of growing up and outgrowing the world you were raised in, the shape of the story fits. And that, more than any single scene or twist, might be the quiet reason this film has had the staying power it has. Alright, that's the deeper cut of this box. Let's bring it back around now to where we land on all of this. There's still more to open here, because we haven't talked enough about how this film actually looks frame by frame, and why those choices matter so much to the story it's telling. So let's go even farther into the box, because the visual language of Luca is doing more storytelling work than most people give it credit for. Start with color, because color in this film isn't decoration. It's a kind of emotional map. Underwater, in the opening stretch of the film, the palette is cool. Blues, deep tees, soft grays, that filtered sunlight effect drifting down from above. Everything down there feels muted, contained, almost like a held breath. The moment Luca and Alberto break the surface for the first time, the palette doesn't just brighten, it explodes. Warm ochres, sun-bleached pinks, deep terracotta rooftops, that impossibly saturated Mediterranean blue sky. The contrast isn't subtle, and it's not supposed to be. The film wants your body to feel the shift before your brain even registers what's happening. Down there is calm and contained, up there is loud and alive. And here's the detail that rewards a closer look. Every time Luca starts to feel fear or shame or the weight of hiding who he is, the film quietly cools the palette around him again, even while he's still on land. Watch the scenes where he's lying to Julia or avoiding Alberto or sitting alone after the big fight. The warmth drains out of the frame just slightly, just enough. The world doesn't change. His relationship to it does. And the color follows that emotional truth rather than the literal setting, which is a remarkably sophisticated piece of visual storytelling for a film that, on the surface, looks like a simple sunny kids movie. Now let's talk about the character designs themselves, because there's a lot of thought packed into how these characters are built, and it goes beyond just cutesy creature versus ordinary kid. Look at Luca's sea creature form. The design leans soft, rounded edges, big expressive eyes, a kind of approachable, almost amphibian cute look that immediately signals this is not something to be afraid of, even before the story tells you that. Compare that to the murals and statues around Porto Rosso, the ones depicting sea monsters as something out of a sailor's nightmare. Jagged teeth, twisted bodies, eyes meant to terrify. The gap between those two designs is the entire thesis of the film, rendered purely in art direction. The monster the town has been afraid of for generations doesn't exist. It was never real. It was always just a kid who likes facts about the solar system and wants to ride a Vespa. And then there's Alberto's design, which I think is more emotionally loaded than people realize. As a sea creature, Alberto's coloring is slightly more rugged, a little more weathered than Luca's. Subtle, but it's there. Almost like his design is hinting at a life that's been harder, lonelier, more exposed to the elements. As a human, his clothes are mismatched, a little too big in places, clearly assembled rather than chosen. Because of course they were. He's been dressing himself alone for years with no one to guide him. Compare that to Luca's human design, which feels slightly more put together, slightly more normal, at least at first. Visually, before either character says a word about their family situation, the film has already told you which of these two kids has had someone looking out for them and which one hasn't. Here's another layer worth pulling on: the design of Porto Rosso itself, and how it changes depending on who's looking at it. To Luca and Alberto arriving from the sea, the town initially feels enormous, almost overwhelming: tall buildings, narrow alleys, crowds of people, all of it slightly disorienting, shot with angles that emphasize how small these two characters feel in this new environment. But as the film goes on, and as Lucas specifically starts to feel more at home in Julia's house, in the classroom, on the streets he's memorized, the town starts to feel smaller, more familiar, more navigable. The geography of Porto Rosso doesn't change. The framing of it does. That's the film visually tracking Lucas' sense of belonging without ever needing a single line of explanation. Let's shift now to the voice cast, because I touched on this earlier, but there's more worth saying here, especially once you start comparing performances against each other rather than looking at them individually. Jacob Tremblay's performance as Luca is built almost entirely on a kind of breathless excitement. There's a quality to his delivery where Lucas sounds like he's constantly catching up to his own feelings, like the words are arriving just slightly after the emotion is already taken over. That works beautifully for a character who's experiencing almost everything for the first time. Every reaction feels immediate, unfiltered, unprocessed, because that's exactly what Luca is. A kid with zero emotional callous is encountering the world raw. Judd Dylan Grazer Alberto, by contrast, has this layer of performance happening on top of performance. Even in his most confident moments, and Alberto is confident a lot, there's something underneath the bravado that feels just slightly too loud, just slightly too eager to convince you. It's a performance about performing, if that makes sense. And the moments where that cracks, where Alberto's voice drops that bravado even for a few seconds, land so much harder because of how consistently bravado is maintained everywhere else. There's a real emotional intelligence in that vocal performance, the kind that doesn't always get recognized in animated films because people assume the animation is doing all the work. It isn't. The animation is reacting to the voice word, not the other way around. Emma Berman's Julia deserves real credit too, because comic relief characters in animated films can so easily become one note: loud, fast, exhausting. But there's a warmth underneath Julia's intensity that comes through in how Berman delivers her lines, especially in quieter moments with Luca, where the speed drops and you can hear someone who's genuinely just thrilled to have found people who want to listen to her. And then there's Sacha Baron Cohen as Uncle Ago, who appears for what amounts to a handful of minutes total, and somehow leaves one of the most memorable impressions in the entire film. His performance leans into something almost unsettling, a creature so isolated, so adapted to total darkness that normal social interaction comes out slightly wrong, slightly too intense, in a way that's funny and a little eerie at the same time. It's a small role, but it's doing a lot of work because Uncle Ago represents the worst case version of what happens to a sea creature who never leaves the deep. He's the warning Luca's parents are using to keep their son in line. And the film lets you feel, just for a moment, why that warning might actually have some truth to it, even if the solution his parents propose is wrong. Now, here's something worth sitting with for a second: the chemistry between Luca and Alberto specifically, because so much of this film rests on whether you believe these two characters genuinely love each other, in the way only kids that age can. And I think what sells it isn't the big moments, the daydreams, the declarations, the fight. It's the small stuff, the way they finish each other's thoughts, the way they fall into an established rhythm almost instantly. Like this is a friendship that's been building for longer than the few weeks we've actually seen. There's an ease to their back and forth that feels lived in from the very first scene they share, and that ease is what makes the back half of the film hurt the way it does. You're not watching two characters who just met Fallout. You're watching two characters who feel like they've known each other forever, suddenly not know how to talk to each other at all. That shift from effortless to awkward is one of the more quietly devastating things this film does, and it's almost entirely carried by vocal performance and animation timing other than dialogue. Let's talk about the score for a bit longer too, because Dan Romer's music is doing some really specific emotional work that's easy to miss if you're not listening for it. A lot of the score leans on acoustic instrumentation, guitar, accordion, mandolin, light percussion, which gives the whole film this handmade, almost folk song quality. But notice how the music behaves differently depending on whose emotional perspective a scene is centered on. Scenes built around Luca's wonder tend to have music that swells, that opens up, that feels like it's expanding alongside his sense of possibility. Scenes built around Alberto's loneliness, even when Alberto himself is acting cheerful, tend to have music that's quieter, sparser, sometimes just a single instrument holding a simple, slightly melancholic line underneath all that forced energy. The music is, in a sense, telling you the emotional truth of a scene even when the characters on screen are trying to hide it. That's a technique you see in a lot of great film scoring. The music as a kind of subconscious narrator, and Luca uses it with more restraint and precision than you might expect from a film this visually loud and colorful. And here's a specific musical moment worth calling out, the transition into the Vespa daydream sequence we talked about earlier. Listen to how the score shifts there. It doesn't just get bigger. It gets looser, almost improvisational, like the instruments themselves are dreaming alongside the animation. And then, when the daydream ends and the film snaps back to reality, the music doesn't crash back down dramatically. It just quietly resolves almost mid phrase, like a song that got interrupted before it finished. That tiny musical incompleteness mirrors exactly what we talked about before, the gap between the dream and the reality these two kids are actually living in. Now let's zoom out for a moment because I think Luca makes a lot more sense once you place it inside the bigger picture of what Pixar was doing as a studio around this time. This film arrived in a stretch where Pixar was making a deliberate pivot towards smaller, more personal, more culturally specific stories. Films that weren't built around a high concept gimmick like talking toys or emotions living in a control room, but around a single character's very particular relationship to a very particular place. Around the same period, Pixar released other films that leaned into specific cultural settings and intimate, coming of age stakes rather than sprawling universe building. Luca fits that pattern almost perfectly. A small town, a handful of characters, one summer, one friendship. In some ways, it's Pixar at its most modest in years. And I think that modesty is part of why it sometimes gets overlooked in conversations about the studio's best work. It's not trying to compete on scale with films about an entire afterlife or an entire internal emotional ecosystem. It's trying to compete on intimacy, and intimacy is a much harder thing to market even when it's done well. It's also worth placing Luca within a longer tradition of films, animated and otherwise, about the Italian coast and about that specific kind of nostalgic, sun-drenched, slightly melancholic summer that so much European cinema has returned to again and again. There's a clear lineage here, a kind of visual and emotional shorthand for a summer that changed everything, and Luca is unmistakably part of that tradition, even if it's wearing a Pixar coat of paint. The crumbling architecture, the long golden afternoons, the sense that something important is happening precisely because it's temporary. That's not a new feeling in cinema. What's new is seeing it rendered through this particular lens, with sea creatures and animated transformation sequences layered on top of something that underneath feels almost like a memoir. Let's talk about food for a second, because I don't think enough people give Luca credit for how it uses food as a storytelling device, and it's one of those details that feels so natural you might not even register it as a choice. The Portorosso cup itself ends with a pasta eating contest, which on the surface is just a fun, slightly chaotic comedic beat. But think about what that detail is actually doing. Food in this film is communal, it's something shared at tables, prepared by families, eaten in groups. For two characters who have spent their entire lives eating fish, alone in the ocean, sitting down to a massive, ridiculous shared plate of pasta, even in the middle of a competition, is its own quiet symbol of a belonging. It's almost a baptism into human life. And the film frames it with just enough comedy that you don't notice how thematically loaded the moment actually is. And speaking of comedy, let's talk about how humor functions in this film overall, because Luca uses comedy very differently depending on what it's trying to protect or reveal. A lot of the humor around Julia, for instance, comes from her intensity, her facts, her slightly off rhythm social timing. But the film is always laughing with her, never at her. And crucially, the other characters who do laugh at her are framed as small minded for doing so. That's a subtle but important choice. The humor isn't punching down at difference, it's punching at the people who can't handle difference. Compare that to the humor around Hercule, the arrogant local champion, which is much broader, much more exaggerated, almost cartoonish villain comedy. That's intentional too. Hercule represents the kind of fear based social hierarchy the film is quietly critiquing, and making him ridiculous is the film's way of deflating that hierarchy without ever needing to seriously confront it. The comedy isn't just there to lighten the mood, it's doing ideological work, telling you who the film thinks deserves to be taken seriously and who doesn't. Here's one more idea worth sitting with, because it reframes the entire transformation concept in a way that I think is genuinely clever, even if the film never makes it explicit. In a lot of stories, horror stories, especially, transformation is something to be feared. A person becomes a monster, and that becoming is the threat. Luca takes that exact narrative shape. Creature becomes human, human becomes creature, triggered by something as simple as water, and strips out all the horror. The transformation in this film is never treated as a loss of self. It's treated as neutral, almost mundane, just a different state of being the same person. And by doing that, the film quietly argues against an entire genre's worth of storytelling that treats difference or change or becoming something else as inherently dangerous. The only danger in Lucas' transformations comes from how other people might react to seeing them, not from the transformation itself. That's the whole argument of the film, compressed into its core visual gimmick. Now, let's go back to the ending one more time, because there's a structural detail there that I think deserves its own moment, separate from everything else we said about it. Notice the symmetry in who lets go of whom, and in what order. First, Luca's parents have to let go of Luca, the people who raised him, releasing him into a life they can't follow him into. Then, almost immediately after, Alberto has to be the one who's chosen, who's offered a place, who's the one being held on to rather than the one being released. The film structures its fine and emotional beats as a kind of relay, letting go on one side, being caught on the other. And I think that structure is what makes the ending feel complete rather than lopsided. It's not just Luca gets to stay, it's everyone, in their own way, ends up exactly where they need to be. Luca's parents back in the sea, but at peace. Luca in Porto Rosso, finally free to be curious out loud. And Alberto, for the first time in the entire film, not alone in that tower anymore. And here's the very last more detail I want to leave you with before we move into the verdict, because it's easy to miss and it ties everything together. Throughout the film, water has meant different things to different characters. Danger to Luca's parents, home to Alberto, the unknown to Luca himself. By the final scene, all three of those meanings are still technically true. The ocean hasn't changed. What's changed is how each character relates to it. Luca's parents still fear the surface, but they've chosen to let their fear coexist with their son's happiness. Alberto still calls the water home, but now he also has a place on land with people who want him there. And Luca gets to stand at the edge of both worlds, belonging to neither one completely and belonging to both at the same time. That, more than the race, more than the reveal, more than any single plot beat, is the actual resolution of this film. Not, the monsters are accepted, something quieter than that. Everyone finds a way to hold both fear and love at the same time without one cancelling out the other. There's one more layer of this film worth opening before we head into the verdict, and it's a layer hiding in something most people never think twice about: the names. Names in this film are doing quiet work everywhere you look, and once you start noticing it, it adds a whole extra dimension to scenes you've already watched. Start with the town itself. Porto Rosso translates roughly to red port, and once you know that, go back and look at how this town is actually painted. Warm reds, deep oranges, terracotta rooftops, faded crimson shutters on half the buildings in frame. The name isn't just a pretty Italian word the filmmakers liked. It's baked directly into the color identity of the entire setting. Every wide shot of this town is, in a sense, fulfilling its own name. And red, in a lot of visual storytelling, carries this dual meaning: warmth and danger, welcome and warning at the same time. For a town built on fear of sea monsters, that's not a small detail. Porto Rosso is, quite literally, a red flag dressed up as a postcard. Now look at Ercole Visconti's name specifically, because this is one of those details that feels almost like a private joke, buried in plain sight. Ercole is the Italian form of Hercules, the legendary strongman, the figure built entirely around physical dominance and reputation. And what is Ercole in this story, if not a small-town Hercules? A kid who's built an entire identity and an entire social hierarchy around being the strongest, the best, the one nobody dares to challenge? Except, as we talked about earlier, that reputation is mostly hollow. Nobody's actually tested it. The name sets up an expectation of mythic strength, and the character quietly fails to live up to it the moment anyone actually pushes back. That's not an accident. That's a filmmaker having a little bit of fun with classical reference hidden inside a kid's movie, for anyone paying close enough attention. Here's another one, and this is a phrase that's become almost a cultural touchstone for fans of this film in the years since its release. At one point, Alberto teaches Luca a phrase to use whenever he's nervous, whenever he feels like he's about to do or say something that might give them away. Silenzio, Bruno. Roughly, it translates to quiet, Bruno. And Bruno here isn't a person. It's a stand-in for that inner voice, that nagging, anxious, self-doubting part of your brain that tells you not to take the leap, not to speak up, not to risk it. Alberto frames it almost like a joke, a fun trick, something silly to laugh about. But look at what it's actually teaching Luca to do. It's teaching him to silence his instincts, including, sometimes, the instincts that are trying to protect him or warn him or tell him something's wrong. And here's where that phrase becomes genuinely haunting if you trace it across the film. Luca uses Silenzio Bruno in small harmless moments at first, pushing past nervousness to try new food, to talk to Julia, to take a risk that turns out fine. But by the time we get to the moment where Luca fizzes, where he hesitates to stand up for Alberto in front of the whole town, in some interpretations that hesitation is Bruno too. Not the nervous voice telling him to be brave, the nervous voice telling him to protect himself, to stay hidden, to choose safety. The film never explicitly draws this line for you, but once you see it, Silenzio, Bruno, stops being a cute catchphrase and becomes something a little more complicated. A tool that can help you grow or a tool that can help you hide, depending on which voice inside you it's actually silencing. That ambiguity, I think, is one of the smartest, most quietly mature things in the entire film. And it's wrapped inside 3 words that most people just remember as that funny phrase from Luca. Let's also talk about how this film uses the Italian language itself, because it's doing something a lot of American animated films set abroad don't bother with. Luca doesn't translate everything. Background characters speak in Italian, signage is in Italian, certain phrases, including Silenzio, Bruno itself, are left untranslated, trusting you to feel the meaning through tone and context rather than through subtitles. That choice matters. It means the film never fully explains itself to you. It lets the setting remain, in small ways, a little foreign, even to an English speaking audience watching in English, and I think that's actually appropriate given the story. Luca and Alberto are outsiders stepping into a world that doesn't fully explain itself to them either. The audience gets to feel a tiny echo of that same disorientation just by hearing a language they may not fully understand, layered into a world that otherwise feels warm and familiar. Now, here's something worth connecting that goes beyond this film alone. Not long after Luca was released, Pixar put out another film, Turning Red, that on the surface looks completely different. Different setting, different decade, different culture, a much louder, much more chaotic tone. But thematically, the two films are doing something remarkably similar, and I think watching them as a kind of unofficial pair tells you a lot about what Pixar was exploring during this stretch of its history. Both films center on a young person hiding a transformation from the people closest to them. Both films use that transformation as a stand-in for something deeply personal: identity, change, the parts of yourself that emerge as you grow up and that your family might not be ready for. And both films ultimately land on a similar emotional resolution. Not the transformation goes away, but the people who love you learn to make room for it. Where the two films differ is tone and intensity. Turning Red leans into chaos, embarrassment, loudness. The transformation is messy, uncontrollable, impossible to hide for long. Luca, by contrast, is quiet, controlled, almost graceful. The transformation can be hidden, managed, performed around, right up until it can't be anymore. And I think the difference in tone actually mirrors the difference in what each film is really about underneath the metaphor. Turning Red is about something that happens to you suddenly, whether you're ready or not. Luca is about something that's always been true about you, that you've simply never had the chance to reveal. Two very different emotional experiences, wearing two very similarly shaped costumes. If you've seen both, and you go back to Luca with Turning Red fresh in your memory, I think you notice just how much these two films are quietly talking to each other. Let's shift gears now and talk about something a little more grounded: the real-world ripple effect this film had, because Luca didn't just exist as a streaming release. It became, in a small but noticeable way, part of the conversation around Italian coastal tourism. The towns that reportedly inspired Porto Rosso, places along the Italian Riviera, the kind of cliffside villages with pastel buildings stacked above the water, already had a certain romantic reputation among travelers. But after this film's release, you could find no shortage of online posts, videos, and articles specifically framing trips to that region through the lens of visiting the real Lucca towns. Whether or not that was ever the filmmaker's intention, it's a neat little example of how an animated film, even one that arrived with no theatrical fanfare, can still leave fingerprints on how people see a real place. Somewhere out there right now, someone is probably walking through Vernazza or Manarola, recognizing the light, the color of the buildings, the texture of the stone, and thinking about a sea creature and his Vespa dream, even if they've never said it out loud. Now, let's talk about rewatch value, because this is genuinely one of the more interesting tests you can apply to any film, and Luca passes it in a slightly unusual way. A lot of films built around a twist or a big emotional reveal lose some of their power on a second viewing. Once you know what's coming, the suspense drains out. Luca isn't really built around suspense in that sense. You know fairly early what these characters are. The twist, if you can even call it that, is never really hidden from the audience, only from the town. So what changes on a rewatch isn't your understanding of the plot. It's your understanding of the characters. The second time through, you're not watching to find out what happens. You're watching Alberto's face during the scenes where Luca starts pulling away and seeing exactly how much he's hiding right from the start. You are watching that empty chair in his tower with completely different eyes. You're listening to Silenzio Bruno with the ending already in your head and hearing it land differently every single time he says it. That's actually a pretty rare quality for an animated film aimed partly at younger audiences. A story that rewards you more for already knowing the ending than for not knowing it. And I think that's part of why Luca has had the kind of slow burn, rewatch life it's had. It's not a film people necessarily rewatch for the plot. It's a film people rewatch to spend more time with two characters they've grown to care about in a town that feels every single time like coming back somewhere familiar. There's one last small thing I want to point out before we move into the verdict, because it's such a tiny detail, and it's exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to dig up. Throughout the film, whenever Luca and Alberto are nervous about getting splashed with water, watch how they react to rain specifically versus how they react to, say, a wave or a bucket of water or a fountain. Rain is unpredictable. It comes from everywhere all at once, completely outside their control. Every other source of water in this film is something they can see coming, something they can dodge, plan around, manage. Rain is the one thing that can expose them with absolutely no warning. And of course, it's raining during the final race. Not as a coincidence, not as set dressing, but as the one variable in this entire story that neither of them could ever fully control, finally arriving at exactly the moment everything else has already started to unravel. The universe in this film doesn't wait for you to be ready. It just rains. So let's bring this all the way back around. Because after everything we've opened up together, the production story, the friendship, the fear on both sides of the water, the ending that chooses comfort over confrontation, it's time to land on the actual verdict. And I want to be honest with you here, the way I've tried to be honest throughout this entire breakdown, because that's the whole point of this channel. My personal rating for Luca sits at 5.4 out of 10. And I know that number might surprise some of you, especially after everything we just walked through about how beautiful this film looks, how warm it feels, how much genuine craft went into every frame of it. So let me actually explain that number. Because a rating without reasoning behind it is just noise, and that's not what we do here. A 5.4 isn't a bad film score. This film knew exactly how good it could be and chose not to go their score. Everything Luca needed to be a truly great film is already sitting inside it. The metaphor is there. The emotional stakes are there. The characters, especially Alberto, are written with enough depth that you can feel the bigger version of this story underneath the one we actually got. But again and again, at the exact moments where this film could have pushed further, gone deeper, sat in discomfort a little longer, it pulls back into something gentler, safer, easier to swallow. And for some viewers, that gentleness is the whole appeal. For me, watching it as someone who breaks films down for a living, it left me with this lingering feeling of almost there, so close. And that almost is what keeps this film from climbing higher on my list, even though I'd never tell anyone not to watch it. So who should watch Luca and why? If you're someone who wants a film to wrap around you like a warm blanket, something visually stunning, emotionally gentle, with a friendship at its center that feels genuinely sweet rather than manufactured, this is absolutely for you. If you grew up feeling like you were hiding some part of yourself from the people closest to you, whether that's about identity or interests or just who you really are, underneath the version of yourself you show your family, this film is going to land somewhere personal for you, even if it never says any of that out loud. And if you're a parent watching this with your kids, there's something here for you too. That quiet, devastating moment where Luca's mother lets him go, recognizing her own younger self in his eyes, is one of the most adult emotional beats in the entire film, even though it's wrapped in a kid's movie. But who might not connect with this one? If you're someone who watch films like Inside Out or Coco or even Up, and you're expecting that same gut punch, that same willingness to sit in real grief or real loss without flinching, Luca is in that film, and I think going in expecting that is the fastest way to walk away disappointed. This film is softer by design. It's not trying to break your heart. It's trying to hold it gently for 90 minutes and hand it back to you a little lighter. If that's not what you're looking for tonight, this might feel slight to you. And honestly, that's a fair reaction. It's not a wrong one. In terms of how to watch it, this isn't a film that demands a cinema screen or a big sound system to land. Its biggest strengths are intimate ones: the friendship, the water, the light, the quiet emotional beats between a parent and a child. This is a film that's perfectly suited to streaming, to a quiet evening, to watching curled up on a couch rather than in a packed theater. You don't need spectacle to feel what this film is trying to make you feel. You just need to actually sit with it, instead of letting it play in the background while you do something else. Because if you give it your full attention, even for its hour and a half, it rewards you with more than you'd expect from a first glance. And here's the one line I want to leave you with about this film because I think it's the truest thing I can say about it. Luca is a film about the moment your world gets bigger than the one you are born into, and about how terrifying and how necessary that moment always is for everyone involved. Not just for the person stepping into the bigger world, but for everyone who loves them and has to learn how to let them go. That's a universal feeling. That's something almost everyone watching this has lived through in some form, whether it was leaving home or coming out or simply growing into a version of yourself your family didn't expect. Luca tells that story gently, maybe too gently for my taste, but it tells it with real care, real craft, and real love. And that's worth something, even if it's not everything. Every film is a box, and we open this one together. Now, before we wrap up, I want to say a genuine thank you for sticking with me through this entire breakdown of Luca. These deep dives take a lot of time and care to put together, and the fact that you're still here, all the way at the end, means more than you probably realize. If this kind of layer by layer breakdown is something you enjoy, not just plot summaries but actually digging into why a film works, where it falls short, and what it's really trying to say underneath all of it, then hitting that like button genuinely helps this channel grow, and subscribing means you won't miss the next one. And if you've got thoughts on this film, I genuinely love to hear them in the comments. So here's the question I want to leave you with tonight. Do you think Luca's gentle, comforting approach to its themes is exactly what makes it special? Or do you think it holds the film back from being something truly unforgettable? I'm genuinely curious where you land on that because I know not everyone is going to agree with my 5.4, and honestly, that's part of what makes these conversations worth having. Coming up next on the film box, we're going to be opening a very different kind of box. A film that doesn't pull back, doesn't soften its edges, and isn't afraid to sit in discomfort for as long as it needs to. If Luca left you wanting something with a little more weight to it, I think you're going to want to be here for that one. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the film box. See you in the next one.